alcohol use can have an effect on your mental health. You know, it sort of seems like a lot of mental health issues are related to two things. Too much of something that isn't really that healthy, or not enough of something that is healthy. Not all issues, but a lot. I know I have found this to be true in my life. And alcohol is no exception. Alcohol, when used especially in higher amounts and consistently, can absolutely have an impact on mental health. Now, a lot of what I found online from places like the NIAAA, which is the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, it focuses on abuse or addiction. And we're going to get into that because it's important. But you don't have to have an addiction or abuse alcohol to experience the effects of alcohol on your mental health. Let's start with the brain because the brain affects the mind and the mood. I brought up the Huberman Lab podcast on part 2 of how alcohol affects our health. And in it, he discusses how alcohol affects the brain. Few things he brings up. Alcohol affects our mood. Alcohol initially, when consumed, it sharply increases serotonin and dopamine. These are brain chemicals. It increases the production of both of those, which can create feelings of pleasure. And then that feeling of pleasure declines as the brain balances itself out, which usually returns these chemicals to a normal level. But as consumption continues over time, serotonin and dopamine levels, they don't spike as high with the same amount of alcohol, which means we have to drink more to get the same response in these chemicals. We're not necessarily talking about a buzz or intoxication. We're talking about the brain's response related to these two chemicals. So they don't spike as high, and so we drink more. But what scientists have found is that the drop in these chemicals after they spike, this rebalancing, it doesn't return to normal levels, but below normal levels. This is actually distressful, even painful, and it affects our mood. This is how tolerance works in the brain. It takes more of something to produce the same effect, but more of it still leads to a bigger decline in these chemical levels. The spikes aren't as strong, but the decline still is. This is part of how people get stuck in drinking cycles. This is the chemical side of dependency. If you want to dive into this more, I recommend Anna Lembke's book, Dopamine Nation. It's a fantastic book. Also, I talk about this a little bit in Mental Health and Jesus video on YouTube, so you can check that out. I'll link both of those. But getting back to what we were talking about, this chemical side of dependency can become a real serious matter. In fact, people who are truly addicted to alcohol as a drug chemically, they can't go cold turkey when they get off it. They need to be weaned off because of the brain's dependency. Even in low amounts, though, alcohol has an effect on our thinking and our mood. Also, emotions, which we covered in the previous podcast, they are lumped into the category of mental health, and that's because what goes on in the mind is affected by emotions. When we go through the process of numbing and escaping and not dealing with feelings by using alcohol, it can have a lot of issues in terms of our mind and how we think and how we process things. We might think we're dealing with stress when we have a drink or a couple beers because feelings dissipate, but we're actually not doing anything about it. And it can lead to more stress, which causes more distress and can lead to constant feelings of anxiety or depression or even shame. We might think we're dealing with anxiety through drinking, but actually we're just compounding the problem and we're going to have more of it later and even more intensely. We might think we're dealing with shame by numbing it, but simply numbing it is just creating a shame cycle, which can lead to more shame, anxiety, and depression. So distressful emotions like fear, sadness, anger, shame, all of these, they are compounded and they are amplified when consistently dealing with them through escaping and numbing. This leads to constant anxiety or depression, and it erodes our mental health. I get into this in the video, Emotions and the Brain, also Jesus and Mental Health on YouTube. You can check those out. Again, they're linked. Anyway, you can see that numbing and escaping through alcohol, it actually compounds our problems and our struggles. Alcohol in general messes with our brain chemistry and it alters our mood, and all of this affects our mental health. It's no wonder that people who really struggle with alcohol abuse have higher levels of depression and higher levels of anxiety. I don't know many recovering addicts that would say that when they were actively involved in their addiction, their mental health was great. It's not a story or a comment I've ever heard. And this is not just my opinion. This is backed up by the NIAAA. Here's what they say. Quote, alcohol use disorder, AUD, often co-occurs with other mental health disorders, either simultaneously or sequentially. The prevalence of anxiety, depression, and other psychiatric disorders is much higher among persons with AUD compared to the general population. By far, the most common mental health conditions that co-occur with AUD are depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, trauma and stress-related disorders, other substance use disorders, and sleep disorders. Furthermore, psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia often co-occur with AUD. End quote. So alcohol in general has an effect on our mood, but in quantities that numb us and help us escape. You see those issues really affect mental health, especially when it comes to addiction and alcohol use disorder and abuse. So going alcohol-free, cutting out alcohol completely, will almost certainly have a positive effect on your mental health, your brain, and your overall day-to-day mood. Of course, it doesn't always seem that way at first because you start to feel emotions you've never really felt fully or dealt with. If you have anxiety or depression, you lose a short-term coping mechanism in alcohol, and while it's unhealthy, it still provided some relief in the short term. That's gone now, and so you're just left to wrestle with your thoughts and your feelings. This isn't easy, and if you're wondering how do you deal with this, I'll get into that later in the month as we talk about what to start doing to replace what you stopped doing, which is drinking alcohol. But that is it for today. I hope this is helpful for whatever your goals are this month and beyond. And as always, thanks for listening.